We got to talk about cultural issues and DEI and ESGs and all these acronyms again. It's in the news. And our friend Zack has an opinion piece at the Daily Wire talking about how left-wing activists are trying to save corporate wokeness. So let's, I guess, go back to the beginning, because we've got there's this big culture war in media these days, right? Like you had Star Wars, The Acolyte, and in the video game world, there's like a good handful of games that completely got co-opted and are pushing a lot of a lot of DEI stuff, and they're funded by ESGs, David. But Zack, what prompted you to write this article? What's going on here?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on the show. I think so. There's a couple things, right? One is just by virtue of the work I do. I work for a proxy consultant that works in a lot of anti-ESG investing, that sort of thing. So that was kind of the broad kind of context that spurred me to write about the piece. But specifically in regards to trying to save corporate wokeness, well, that implies that there's been some kind of back away from corporate wokeness. Now, if you haven't been paying attention to the news, this kind of move has happened at a number of really high-profile companies, including John Deere, Tractor Supply, Ford, KURV, etc. Many companies have backed away from policies that advance DEI, policies that advance what would be tantamount to ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. So it's a lot of the political side taking. You can see this as early back as Nike and Colin Kaepernick. A lot of these policies that have kind of been baked into corporate parlance for years. Well, in the past year or so, a lot of companies have, in response to outside pressure, in response to shareholder pressure as well, have kind of rolled back some of these policies. One of the big policies that has been, one of the big practices that has been reduced in recent past is decreased cooperation with an organization called the Human Rights Campaign. It sounds like a lovely organization, right? The Human Rights Campaign is one of the most pernicious organizations pushing progressivism on modern business. And they do so through this corporate scoring tool called the Corporate Equality Index. It scores businesses on a number of things, including on whether they provide puberty blockers to children as part of their healthcare plan, this sort of thing, right? So one of the major moves away from corporate wokeness we've seen in the past year has been a lack of, at least in word, a lack of participation with the Human Rights Index. But here's the thing. I work with shareholders, I work with clients all the time, I talk with investor relations all the time, and the reason I wrote the piece was to indicate that just because a business says they've stopped providing data to a partisan organization that advances politics over fiduciary duty doesn't mean that that shift is necessarily happening in reality. And what do I mean by that? Well, simply, I mean that organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, in response to having ties severed by groups like John Deere, companies like KURV and Ford, what they've done is, one, they've put out scathing pieces about these companies and how non-inclusive they are, which is, of course, all bunk. It's designed to perpetuate a certain narrative. But more importantly, they've set up anonymous tip lines. They've set up anonymous tip lines within these companies for workers to do two things, right? One, workers can report instances of bias, which, like, okay, if there's actual workplace bias, that's a serious problem. But here's the other thing, that this anonymous tip line allows workers to share what inclusive policies are still being present at the company, right? This is a big tell, right? If this is a poker game, this is a big tell. What does this mean for corporate America? Well, if you hear that your favorite brand has ditched wokeness, so that's great, right? Praise be to God. That's awesome. But here's the deal. As someone who works with clients and works with shareholders all the time, let's be willing to take that with a grain of salt and have an inquiring mind about that. Let's be real, because what the Human Rights Campaign has done is, even as companies are backing off from inclusive policies in their language, or so-called inclusive policies, DEI-esque policies in their language, a lot of the policies they have simply moved from public all over the face of the website every Black History Month, every Pride Month. They've simply become backdoor policies. They've become indoor policies. They've become closed-door policies that are, in fact, no less pernicious than the openly pro-progressive policies that existed beforehand. It's basically the tone has shifted from one of open acquiescence to progressive dogma to subtle. It's gone behind closed doors, and the point of writing the piece is we need to be aware of that as we're dealing with these companies, as shareholders, as customers. We simply need to be not merely take companies at their word when they say that they have backed off of DEI policies, but actually examining what's going on behind the scenes to make sure that we can actually get businesses out of politics and back to neutral and back to fiduciary focus.
Amen, brother. Yeah, Isaac Willour joining us on 710 KURV. He's got an opinion piece at the Daily Wire. How left-wing activists are trying to save corporate wokeness. Go ahead, Davey.
Is there are there no stockholders who inquire about this at the annual meetings, or who or in between the annual meetings to bring it up?
Or are they relying on that ESG money?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. I mean, this is literally what I do. So the firm I work for is called Boyer, Bowyer Research. We work with a lot of shareholders. We work with institutional investors. Because the reality is, guys, for years, the right took corporate America for granted. We took it for granted that corporate America was always going to be a bastion of kind of right-wing conservatism, laissez-faire, pro-free market stuff. And while we took it for granted, this happened for decades, right? The movement towards ESG goes back decades. It goes back to the Millennium Declaration. It arguably goes back before that. But while the right took corporate America for granted, left-wing activists infiltrated corporate America and began pushing their own agendas into corporate parlance, right? So the right just didn't show up to the table for years and years and years. Let me give you an example, right? I was recently at a meeting with a company that I won't name on the record, obviously, but we were discussing their charity gift match discrimination. So they won't match charity gifts. This is a pretty common corporate policy, but they won't match them to certain religious nonprofits, right? So it kind of stinks of maybe racial discrimination, at the very least racial animus. And we mentioned this to the investor relations team at this company. And the investor relations team didn't know what the company's own policies were, so they just guessed. Well, we just matched all nonprofits, right? We don't have it. And we had to be the ones to point out on behalf of our client, that's actually not true. This company has several, the effect is anti-religious bias in its charity matching program. Here's what the lesson of that is. Beyond, obviously, there are issues at this company that need fixed, which is what I do for a job, right? What we do on behalf of our clients. The issue is conservatives didn't show up in the ears of investor relations. Until recently, they have not shown up at annual meetings. They haven't put things on shareholder proposals. They haven't been taking control of, one, how they vote on their proxies or who manages that proxy voting. It's a whole nother.
How long has this been going on?
Conversation we could have. How long has that been going on? Oh, a long time. I mean, there's a reason why many conservative organizations outsource their proxy voting to money managers that don't share their values. And as a result, those money managers don't vote their shares in accordance with their values. It's a real problem. It's a problem that my firm exists to help fix.
Joining us on 710 KURV, Isaac Willour, an award-winning journalist and political science student at Grove City College, and he's also a Koch Marketing Fellow at the Institute for Faith and Freedom, among many, many, many other things. So what's the next step here? I mean, it's still a big, broad battle against corporate wokeism and ESGs. What's the next step here?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I mean, let's be real. I think the tide is turning in a lot of real ways. I'm aware that the piece is kind of about don't take a facial win as just indicative that we can just all declare victory and take a victory lap. But the tide is turning against ESG and against DEI for a lot of reasons. We could talk about them, but I think a lot of DEI programs, because many DEI programs genuinely are discriminatory, are taking heat for being so, and rightfully so. I applaud that, and I think more of that scrutiny on DEI programs should come. But the other thing is that ESG, for many, the iterations of ESG for many companies simply aren't really pro-business. Like, you might be aware that there are some, this is public information, so we can talk about it. You might be aware that there are some issues with BlackRock, and there are some issues with JP Chase.
Yes.
What you might not be aware of is that organizations like BlackRock and certain funds within JP Chase are restricted from doing business with certain red states, in like Texas and West Virginia. Like, they've been actively restricted from doing business with state entities. Why? Because JP Chase and BlackRock have policies that effectively boycott certain sectors of the energy industry, aka oil and gas, aka fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. This has cut the company off from business with state clients, which kills revenue, which go back to previous point about ESG not always exactly being pro-fiduciary. That's the other lens from which this turning of the tide is coming. And obviously no discussion about this could be complete without a huge shout out to people like Robbie Starbuck, who you should all go follow on Twitter, highlighting a lot of the wokeness at a lot of these companies like Toyota and John Deere and Tractor Supply were some of the big ones. So I think as someone who does this day to day, the ideal world, the ideal strategy for conservatives, people who are pro-fiduciary duty, who are pro-getting politics out of business, The ideal strategy is that the external game of pressure, of highlighting biased corporate policy, and the internal game of working with clients, of working with shareholders to leverage their institutional corporate influence. In an ideal world, the ideal strategy is the internal and the external game played in tandem. And I think we're getting closer and closer to that. I couldn't be more happy because we owe it, not just to employees and customers who deserve companies in their lives that focus on their primary business focus and not advancing partisan agendas, but also for all the people that the free enterprise system has given human flourishing to. That human flourishing only exists as long as businesses remember what they're there for. Because a business that gets itself blacklisted for bias against the oil and gas sector is a business that is cutting itself off from real-world gains and therefore cutting itself off from an ability to provide increased human flourishing to its customers and to its shareholders. That's what this is about. I think one of the reasons the conservatives kind of not ignored, but took the free market for granted is that we assumed that argument, that the free market, that wealth creation leads to human flourishing, which leads to real people living really better lives. We took that argument for granted. We have to make that argument again as loudly as we possibly can, because here's the deal, guys: the people who push ESG, the people who push DEI, they use the language of human flourishing all the time. They don't own that language. We do, and it's time to make that argument like grown-ups.
Yeah, there you go. And I wish we had more time to get into it, but I've been reading into stories at Sony and at Disney. Like, for example, Sony put 8 years and $400 million into a video game that was uber woke, and it lasted a week before they took it down. I'm not joking. Look that one up. Hey, thanks.
Really good stewardship, right?
Hey, thanks a lot for spending some time with us this afternoon. Appreciate it. That's Isaac Willour. Check out his opinion piece at the Daily Wire, how left-wing activists are trying to save corporate wokeness. You're listening to News Talk 710 KURV, your 956 drive home.